Lureth had always believed in rules. From the moment she joined the Galactic Arbitration Force, she had memorized every clause of the compact, every regulation that governed the endless reaches of space. The galaxy was enormous, filled with species of all kinds, some ancient and proud, others young and hungry. Each species followed its own customs, its own rituals, but above them all was the compact. It was the law that kept chaos at bay, the law that dictated ownership, justice, and consequences. To Lureth, it was perfect in its logic, flawless in its design, and unquestionable in its authority. She stood on the bridge of her patrol vessel, the Viorlian Dawn, her eyes scanning the endless starfield outside the reinforced viewport. The ship's instruments hummed softly, displaying the usual readings of hyperspace currents, energy fluctuations, and the slow drift of ships in nearby sectors. And then her sensors picked up something unusual. A small human freighter, moving slowly, almost lazily, near a restricted corridor. Its transponder codes were outdated, registration incomplete, and it was carrying enough cargo to make it worth seizing. The human freighter was technically trespassing, and under the compact, trespassers could be claimed. Lureth's claws tapped against the control panel. She had faced many species before, some hostile, some compliant. Humans, however, were new to her. They were considered primitive by most advanced species, a race that had only recently gained access to interstellar travel and joined the compact. Few expected them to understand the galaxy's rules, fewer still expected them to survive encounters with seasoned arbitrators like herself. She activated the communication channel. "This is Officer Lureth of the Galactic Arbitration Force. You are in violation of the compact. Prepare for inspection and transfer of control." A moment passed. Then the human voice came, calm, almost casual. "Copy that. We were unaware. We'll comply." There was no panic, no frantic attempts to escape, just calm acknowledgement. It was unusual but not entirely alarming. Humans were unpredictable, but Lureth had a reputation for handling unpredictability. She ordered her ship into interception course, careful to avoid triggering any unnecessary alarms. Her goal was efficiency, not spectacle. The freighter did not resist as the Viorlian Dawn matched its velocity and positioned itself alongside the smaller vessel. Lureth donned her boarding suit. The material fitted tightly over her scaled body, providing protection without hindering movement. She carried no weapons. She did not need them. The airlock opened and Lureth stepped onto the human freighter. The interior was cramped compared to Viorlian standards, but orderly. The human captain, a man named Elias Ward, stood near the control console. His hands were visible empty and he offered no resistance. "You are under lawful seizure by the compact," Lureth announced. Her voice was precise, each word measured, each syllable deliberate. "By galactic law, you are now under my authority." Elias nodded. "Understood," he said simply. "Which law system will judge how you treat what you own?" The question startled her, not because of what it implied, but because of the calm certainty in his tone. Humans were often emotional, impulsive, and reckless, but Elias spoke as if he understood more than she expected. She tilted her head, uncertain for a fraction of a second, then dismissed it. Humans were naive. They had not yet learned the ways of the galaxy. She activated the transport sequence. Elias was to be taken to her ship. He followed without protest, his posture straight, his gaze steady. Lureth noted this. He had no fear, no attempt to flee, no sign of panic. Most species would have cowered or resisted, but humans were strange that way, defiant, yet cooperative, stubborn, yet willing to comply when necessary. Once aboard the Viorlian Dawn, Lureth conducted the customary procedures: identity verification, physiological scans, security assessments. All systems confirmed he was healthy, fit, and compliant. Ownership, as defined by the compact, was complete. Lureth recorded the transfer, filing the necessary digital paperwork in triplicate across 3 separate secure nodes. She expected relief, compliance, maybe even gratitude from the human. Instead, Elias asked another question. What are my rights under this transfer? Lureth froze. Rights were irrelevant under the compact. Ownership was authority, simple and unambiguous. You have the rights guaranteed under the compact, which are minimal. You are to follow lawful orders and receive necessary sustenance. All else is under my discretion. Elias' expression did not change. And if I suffer harm under your discretion, the words were legalistic, almost cautious, but she could feel the subtle challenge within them. No other species had ever questioned ownership in this way. They accepted it because they had no choice, because the compact had always been clear. Humans, she realized slowly, were different. Then it will be noted, and responsibility will be assumed as required, she said. Her voice was firm, confident. She did not realize how close she was to a mistake. For the rest of the day, Lureth observed him. He moved through her ship as if it were his own, studying the technology, asking questions about life support systems, propulsion, and the many instruments she had always taken for granted. His curiosity was polite, restrained, but persistent. He made notes, not to resist, but to understand. By nightfall, she began to feel a subtle unease. Humans were supposed to be simple. They were supposed to accept authority without question. Yet Elias spoke to her, not as a subordinate but as a participant in a dialogue. His questions, carefully chosen, forced her to explain procedures, to justify laws, to articulate concepts she had never been asked to defend. It was unsettling. Lureth, trained to command, to enforce, to dominate without challenge, found herself facing a being who respected her authority yet refused to surrender his mind. There was a tension in the bridge that night, subtle but unrelenting, as if the very air had thickened. "Why do you obey the compact?" Elias asked at last, leaning against a railing, his gaze calm. "Why not choose differently?" Lureth's instincts bristled. "The compact ensures order. Without it there is chaos. Without law there is war. All civilizations must follow it." "This is the way of the galaxy," he nodded slowly. "And yet even in law you can make mistakes. Even in authority you can be judged. You must remember that." She dismissed the warning, yet it lingered. Humans spoke in ways that seemed simple, yet carried weight. They challenged assumptions, tested boundaries, and made one doubt what one thought was unassailable. The following day, Lureth led Elias to the observation deck. Stars stretched infinitely beyond the glass, clusters of light that had guided countless civilizations, yet none as stubborn or unpredictable as humans. She watched him silently as he gazed outward, and she realized for the first time how fragile the galaxy seemed, not because of external threats, but because of assumptions, misunderstandings, and untested laws. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "we will begin training procedures. You must learn the expectations of your new status. Compliance is mandatory." Elias turned, his expression calm. "I understand, but remember, compliance is not the same as agreement." Lureth frowned. His words were irrelevant under the compact, but their persistence was troubling. She decided to monitor him more closely. Ownership, she thought, was a simple matter, but humans were proving it might be more complex than the law allowed. In the following days, Elias integrated into the routines of the ship. He helped in minor tasks, observed maintenance operations, and even offered suggestions, small, intelligent suggestions that improved efficiency. Lureth noted each one meticulously, filing reports to the Galactic Arbitration Force that praised his adaptability and compliance. But at night, when the ship was silent and the stars stretched endlessly, Lureth found herself thinking about his questions, his warnings, and his quiet challenges. By galactic law, he was hers. By galactic law, he was subject to her authority in every way. Yet she could not ignore the growing realization. Humans, even when appearing compliant, had their own systems, their own rules, and their own ways of turning authority on its head. She would learn soon enough that this lesson was only beginning. The day began like any other aboard the Virelian Dawn, with the hum of engines and the soft flicker of control panels. Lureth moved through the corridors with her usual confidence, her scaled skin reflecting the sterile light of the ship. She had come to expect efficiency and order, yet there was a tension now that she could not ignore. Elia's ward, the human she had claimed by galactic law, moved through her ship with a calm curiosity that unsettled her more than any physical threat could have. She found him in the cargo bay, studying the storage systems, noting inefficiencies she had never considered. He approached her as she entered, hands empty, expression calm, almost serene. "Good morning, Officer Lureth," he said. "I've been reviewing the cargo arrays. There's a way to reduce energy expenditure by reorganizing supplies. It will save you at least 5% per cycle." Lureth raised an eyebrow. Suggestions were not dangerous, but they were unusual. Most beings under her control either obeyed silently or offered weak, deferential commentary. Humans were different. They observed, analyzed, and suggested improvements, even when it was not asked for. "Your suggestion is noted," she replied cautiously. "I will consider it." Elias nodded and moved to the far end of the bay, continuing his work. Lureth walked away, feeling the familiar stirrings of unease. She had claimed him by law. The compact said it was simple. Ownership meant control. Yet Elia's calm, methodical intelligence was testing that definition in ways she had never imagined. The first sign of real trouble came when she attempted to restrict his access to the ship's communication systems. Standard protocol required that anyone under lawful claim should not have access to sensitive data unless specifically authorized. She had prepared to deny him access without question. Elias simply presented a small device, projecting a holographic document into the air. It was a translation of human interstellar law, formatted for recognition by the compact. "You are aware that any claim of ownership over a human triggers reciprocal jurisdiction?" he asked. The words were confusing, almost absurd. Lureth had never encountered such a clause. Humans, in her experience, accepted authority or resisted it. Legal loopholes that could turn ownership into a burden were unheard of. "I do not understand your meaning," she said, trying to maintain authority. He smiled faintly, a human expression she had learned to recognize as confidence rather than mockery. "It means that by claiming me, you have agreed to follow human law in all matters relating to my treatment. Any harm, neglect, or misuse of authority is punishable under human legal systems." Lureth's claws tightened on the railing. She had expected surrender, obedience, even fear, but this was something she had not anticipated. Human law, she realized slowly, was not just a set of rules. It was a weapon, subtle, invisible, and powerful. Over the next several hours, she tried to dismiss the warning, continuing with the ship's routine, monitoring his activities, and ensuring compliance with her commands. But every action she took seemed to play into a larger, unseen framework. The communications network, normally under strict Virelian control, began to flash alerts. Automated systems flagged unusual activity related to human legal protocols. At first, she ignored them. Alerts were common, often false, and her experience had taught her to rely on her judgment. Then came the first human delegation. A small fleet arrived at the edge of her patrol sector, not with weapons, not with demands, but with official insignia, holographic transmissions, and legal representatives. They communicated directly, bypassing the Virelian chain of command, insisting on a hearing. Lureth was summoned to present Elia's ward. She complied, curious and wary. She expected confusion, resistance, or some minor diplomatic objection. Instead, she found a courtroom unlike any she had ever imagined. Humans did not rely on intimidation or displays of power. They relied on observation, logic, and accountability. Their representatives, a combination of lawyers, mediators, and AI arbiters, presented evidence and testimony with precision and clarity. Elias spoke first, his tone calm and respectful. He did not accuse or insult. He explained the situation as a matter of fact. By claiming him under galactic law, Lureth had inadvertently subjected herself to human legal jurisdiction. Ownership, as defined by human law, came with responsibilities that went far beyond the compact's definitions. He detailed what those responsibilities entailed: duty of care, protection of rights, and accountability for any harm inflicted. The room was silent as the Virelian arbitrators listened. Lureth herself struggled to respond. She had acted according to the compact, believing her actions were absolute. Yet the human's system operated on a logic she could not easily counter. It was not about strength or dominance. It was about principles, ethics, and the consequences of one's actions. Arguments continued for hours, each point dissected, analyzed, and countered with evidence and precedent. Lureth felt the weight of the process pressing on her scales and bones. Each human argument, precise and unyielding, revealed the gaps in her understanding, the assumptions she had made about authority and obedience. By the end of the first cycle, it became clear that the situation was more complicated than she had imagined. The compact could enforce law across species, but it had never accounted for a species whose own legal system could override or reinterpret ownership. Humans had mastered a form of power that did not rely on conquest, intimidation, or physical dominance. They wielded responsibility as their strength, and it was nearly impossible to resist. Lureth returned to her ship, exhausted but unsettled. Elias had remained calm throughout, observing the proceedings, answering questions, and clarifying points of law. He had not asked for her punishment, nor had he sought revenge. He had only requested adherence to the rules that governed his species, and in doing so, he had demonstrated a kind of strength that was foreign to her. Days passed. Humans arrived in increasing numbers, bringing legal AIs, observers from other species, and representatives of the compact. Lureth found herself navigating a network of laws far more complex than she had ever encountered. Her authority over Elias was questioned, challenged, and systematically dissected. Every attempt to assert control was met with counterarguments rooted in human ethics and logic. Elias, for his part, remained composed. He did not provoke her, yet his very presence was a constant reminder that ownership, as she had understood it, was not absolute. Humans, she realized with growing unease, had a way of turning even the strongest claim into a test of character, judgment, and responsibility. It was during one quiet moment on the observation deck that Lureth truly understood the magnitude of what was happening. Stars stretched endlessly before her, distant and cold, yet she did not feel the vastness of space. She felt the weight of human law pressing upon her, reshaping her understanding of power, authority, and control. Elias stood beside her, silent, watching the same stars, unafraid, calm, yet utterly unyielding in his quiet insistence on justice. "Why are they so patient?" she asked quietly. Elias turned his gaze to her. "Because they have time. Because they understand that true power is not the ability to take, but the ability to be accountable. You have strength, but you are untested. This is your trial." Lureth considered his words. Strength without accountability had always seemed sufficient. The compact rewarded efficiency, conquest, and obedience. Yet here was a species that had survived countless threats not by overwhelming force, but by creating systems that ensured fairness, responsibility, and justice. The days became a blur of hearings, data analysis, and consultations. Lureth found herself struggling to keep pace with human legal structures. She had always believed law to be absolute, a simple hierarchy enforced by power. Yet human law was recursive, adaptive, and moral. It did not merely punish or reward, it educated, corrected, and guided. Her crew, trained to follow her without question, began to whisper among themselves. Some speculated that the humans had found a loophole that could destabilize the compact. Others feared that Lureth's failure to maintain absolute authority could reflect poorly on the Virelian collective. Lureth herself knew the truth. Humans were not weak. They were something far more formidable, a species that had taken vulnerability and turned it into strength, that had transformed limitation into an unbreakable system. One afternoon, Elias requested a private audience. Lureth met him in the conference room, expecting questions or explanations. Instead, he offered guidance. You must understand that ownership in human terms is not about fear or submission, he said. It is about responsibility. You claimed me, and in doing so you have agreed to uphold my rights. You are not punished. You are tested. Your actions will determine the outcome. Lureth felt a strange mix of frustration and admiration. The human's approach was frustrating because it undermined her assumptions, yet admirable because it was fair, clear, and unwavering. The human legal presence grew. Observers documented every step, AI judges analyzed evidence, and cross-species mediators ensured that procedures were followed. Lureth found herself increasingly isolated in her authority. She could command, but she could not enforce without scrutiny. Every action, every decision was measured against human ethics. And then, a breakthrough occurred. Elias demonstrated, through careful reasoning, that her initial claim of ownership, while lawful under the compact, had inadvertently placed her under human jurisdiction. The argument was precise, irrefutable, and elegant. Lureth's position shifted from owner to defendant, not in the sense of punishment, but in the sense of accountability. She was now subject to the very principles she had enforced, measured by standards she had never imagined. It was a humbling realization. Lureth, who had commanded ships, enforced laws, and claimed authority over countless beings, found herself challenged not by force, but by principle. Human justice, she understood, was a weapon far sharper than any blade, more enduring than any fleet, and more precise than any arbitration protocol. By the time the first month concluded, Lureth had learned to navigate the new reality. She monitored her own actions, consulted with humans, and began to understand the delicate balance between authority and responsibility. Elias remained calm, patient, and observant, guiding her not with anger or defiance, but with clarity and reason. The galaxy, she realized, was changing around her. Humans were not merely a species to be dominated or measured. They were a mirror, reflecting what power could be when tempered by morality. And she, once confident in her unassailable authority, was learning a lesson that would shape her, her crew, and the future of the compact itself. For the first time, Lureth understood that to face humans was not to conquer them, but to confront the consequences of claiming what was not truly hers. And in that confrontation, she realized, lay the beginning of a new kind of strength, one measured not in victories or defeats, but in justice, responsibility, and the quiet, unyielding power of a species that refused to be owned. The courtroom remained tense, yet calm, as Lureth stepped forward. She had spent countless cycles enforcing laws, issuing judgments, and claiming authority over beings who could not resist her. Now, she stood as the subject of scrutiny, evaluated not by brute force or intimidation, but by principle and accountability. The human legal presence aboard the Virelian Dawn had grown over the past cycles into a formidable assembly, each participant precise, professional, and unwavering. The lesson she had been learning in fragments was about to reach its culmination. Elias Ward observed silently from the side, calm as ever. He did not speak unless required, and when he did, his words were deliberate, carrying weight far beyond their simplicity. His quiet presence had become a steady force, a reminder to Lureth of the responsibility that came with claiming another being. She had thought ownership was power. Humans had shown her it was accountability. The head human mediator, a sleek AI with a soft golden glow, addressed her. "Officer Lureth, you have claimed a human under the authority of the Galactic Compact. However, in doing so, you have entered into a reciprocal legal arrangement under human law. You are now accountable for all actions taken against the human you claimed, and your authority must be evaluated in this context." Lureth swallowed the instinctive urge to resist. She had no choice but to answer truthfully, to face the consequences. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. In the past, disputes were simple. One party claimed, the other submitted, and law was enforced. Humans had transformed law into a living structure, one that could pierce the very armor of assumed control. Evidence was presented. Records of her claim, her commands, and even the daily routines of Elia's ward were examined. Every action, every choice was dissected. At first, Lureth found herself bristling at the intrusion, but as the hours passed, she began to understand the elegance of the process. Human law did not seek vengeance. It sought clarity, fairness, and improvement. It highlighted errors, yes, but always with the goal of creating better outcomes, not simply punishing mistakes. Elias was called to speak. He stepped forward, measured and confident. "I do not seek retribution," he began. "I only ask that the principles of human justice be applied as intended. Ownership, by our definition, carries responsibility. By claiming me, you have entered an agreement not of choice but of consequence. It is not punishment to uphold this agreement, it is fairness." His words echoed across the chamber. Lureth felt the weight of them pressing into her chest. She had never imagined that submitting to law could feel like such a challenge. In the Virelian system, law was enforced by fear and hierarchy. Compliance was required, and dissent punished. Here, however, the power of law came not from the threat of force but from the inevitability of accountability. As the hearings progressed, Lureth began to notice subtle changes in herself. Her confidence, once absolute, was tempered by reflection. She observed the humans' methods, how they gathered evidence, cross-examined witnesses, and relied on reason rather than intimidation. She began to see the limits of her previous understanding of power. True strength, she realized, was not measured by how many beings she could command, but by how responsibly she wielded authority. Days passed. The hearings drew attention from other species across the compact. Representatives from dozens of worlds watched as a Virelian officer, one of the most respected enforcers in her fleet, faced evaluation not by conquest but by law. Many were skeptical, questioning the humans' methods and the fairness of their judgment. Lureth could feel their eyes, their doubts pressing in. But she also felt a strange sense of clarity forming within her, a growing recognition that humans, in their patience and precision, were teaching a lesson the galaxy had long forgotten. Finally, the human legal AI delivered its preliminary ruling. Lureth listened intently, every scale on her body tightening in anticipation. The AI's voice was calm, measured, and without accusation. The claim of ownership over human Elia's ward by Officer Lureth, while lawful under the Galactic Compact, has triggered reciprocal accountability under human law. Officer Lureth's authority is therefore subject to review. Compliance with human legal standards is required to continue any claim over the individual. Any failure to meet these standards constitutes a breach of responsibility and is subject to correction, education, or restitution. Lureth felt the gravity of the words. She was not condemned, she was not humiliated. She was instructed, evaluated, and held accountable. The distinction was subtle but profound. Humans had not sought to destroy her authority. They had sought to reshape it, to teach her that strength without responsibility was incomplete. Over the next cycles, Lureth underwent an intensive program of education and reflection. Human legal scholars, both AI and organic, guided her through the principles of accountability, ethics, and fairness. She learned how ownership, in their terms, was a partnership of duty and care, not a simple exercise of control. She learned that the compact's definition, while efficient, had gaps that humans were uniquely prepared to illuminate and correct. Elias remained a constant presence throughout the process. He did not chastise, nor did he act superior. He provided guidance, clarification, and calm reminders of the principles at stake. Lureth began to understand that his patience was deliberate, a demonstration of the strength inherent in humans' measured approach to authority. By maintaining his composure, he had forced her to confront her own assumptions and adapt. By the end of the month, the final judgment was issued. The courtroom was filled with representatives from multiple species, all watching closely. The head human mediator addressed the assembly. Officer Lureth has demonstrated understanding and adaptation to the principles of human law. The claim of ownership over Elias Ward is nullified, as it did not meet the requirements of ethical responsibility inherent to such a claim. However, Officer Lureth has completed the remedial program, acknowledged her obligations, and is now equipped to act within the framework of both the Galactic Compact and human legal standards. The ruling was met with quiet approval. Lureth felt a strange mix of relief and pride. She had been tested, challenged, and found accountable, but more importantly, she had learned. She had learned that power alone was insufficient, that authority must be guided by principles, and that even the most seasoned enforcer could grow when confronted with a species that measured strength differently. Elias stepped forward, his calm presence a quiet anchor. "The matter is resolved," he said simply. "No further action is required. The compact and human law are now aligned, and fairness has been restored." Lureth nodded, feeling a deep respect for the human before her. She had claimed him without understanding, and through patience, logic, and principle, he had guided her to comprehension. She realized that humans, despite their apparent fragility, possessed a strength far greater than physical power. They had mastered the art of restraint, accountability, and justice. The impact of the case rippled through the compact. Species that had long relied on domination and conquest began to reassess their own laws. Ownership by conquest was no longer unquestioned. Responsibility, accountability, and ethical consideration became central to interstellar law. Lureth, once a symbol of unyielding authority, became a symbol of adaptation and understanding, a bridge between the traditional methods of the compact and the nuanced morality of human law. Returning to her ship, Lureth reflected on the lessons learned. She had faced humans expecting challenge, rebellion, or weakness. Instead, she found patience, intelligence, and a system of justice that could withstand any test. Elias had not resisted, he had guided. He had not feared, he had taught. She understood now that to claim another being, even by law, was not merely to assert control. It was to accept responsibility, to act with care, and to embody principles that transcended simple obedience. Over the next cycles, Lureth began to integrate these lessons into her work. She trained her crew to value ethical responsibility as much as efficiency. She restructured protocols to incorporate safeguards, ensuring that authority was exercised with care and accountability. And through it all, she maintained a quiet acknowledgement of the human who had taught her so much. Elias Ward, calm, observant, and unyielding in his insistence on justice. The galaxy, she realized, had been changed by this encounter. Humans were no longer newcomers to be underestimated. They were a species whose understanding of power, responsibility, and law could influence even the most rigid systems. Lureth's people, the Virelians, began to see humans not as subjects to dominate, but as partners in shaping a more just and fair galaxy. In the quiet of her quarters, Lureth gazed out at the stars. She had once believed that power was measured in obedience, that authority was proven through fear and compliance. Now she understood that true power was measured in restraint, accountability, and the ability to act ethically even when law and opportunity seemed to allow otherwise. Elias had not been conquered. He had taught. And in doing so, humans had reminded the galaxy that the greatest strength was not in taking what one could, but in wielding power wisely, justly, and with unwavering responsibility. The lesson was clear, and the message resounded across the stars. To face humanity was to confront a species that had mastered power and chosen restraint. That mastery, subtle and enduring, would shape the compact and every species that sought to understand the true meaning of strength. And as the Virelian dawn continued its patrols, now under Luraeth's renewed and wiser guidance, she knew the galaxy was no longer quite the same. Humans had arrived, not to dominate but to teach, and their lesson had been impossible to ignore.